All right, let's get into it. Today, we are tackling one of the biggest, most complicated subjects in all of history, the Second World War. We're going to cut through all the noise and map out exactly how this global catastrophe happened, piece by piece, domino by domino. You've definitely heard these words before, right? A date which will live in infamy. But here's the thing, when President Roosevelt said this after the attack on Pearl Harbor, he wasn't announcing the start of the war. He was marking America's sudden, violent entry into a fire that had already been burning across the entire globe for years, consuming whole nations and costing millions and millions of lives.
So, how did we get there? We've broken it down into 5 parts. First, we'll see how the world caught fire. Then we'll witness the terrifying speed of the Axis blitz. After that, we're going to pinpoint the exact moments the tide turned. We'll follow the long, grinding road to victory. And finally, we'll look at the completely new world that rose from the ashes.
Okay, let's dive right in. Look, World War II didn't just pop up out of nowhere. To really get it, you have to look at the immense pressure that was building up for years beforehand, as these incredibly ambitious and aggressive powers started redrawing the map by force. You know, the 1930s were just a series of incredibly bold, expansionist moves. You had Hitler in Germany rising to power, promising to tear up the treaty that ended the First World War. Then you had Mussolini in Italy, building his own little Roman Empire. And over in Asia, Japan was brutally expanding into China. These three, they all saw the world order as something to be dismantled, so they got together, forming the Rome-Berlin-Tokyo axis. The invasion of Poland in 1939, well, that was just the final match that lit the whole global tinderbox. So, when the war officially kicked off, the Axis powers moved with a speed and a ferocity that just stunned the world. They had this strategy called blitzkrieg, which literally means lightning war. And that's what it was. They'd use overwhelming air power and fast-moving tanks to just punch holes in enemy lines and cause total chaos. It seemed completely unstoppable. And honestly, for the first couple of years, it pretty much was. The first real shock came in 1940. France? I mean, this was a country thought to have one of the most powerful armies on the planet, and it was completely overrun by Germany in just 6 weeks. 6 weeks! It was an absolutely humiliating collapse that left Great Britain to face the might of Nazi Germany all by itself. And can you imagine how desperate that must have felt? The Battle of Britain was fought entirely in the skies over England. The outnumbered Royal Air Force was just desperately trying to hold off the German Luftwaffe. But here's where things get really interesting. Hitler made a huge mistake. He got frustrated by the RAF's resistance, so he switched tactics. Instead of bombing crucial airfields and radar stations, he started terror bombing cities like London. And that tactical error, that was the break the RAF needed. It gave them a vital chance to repair, to regroup, and to ultimately save Britain from invasion. So, having failed to knock out Britain, Hitler then makes the biggest, most insane gamble of the entire war, Operation Barbarossa, a massive, surprise invasion of the Soviet Union. This opened up a vast and unbelievably brutal Eastern Front, stretching for thousands of miles. Hitler, driven by his ideology and just pure arrogance, was convinced the whole Soviet state would just collapse in a few weeks. Oh, how wrong he was. And just as the war in the East was escalating into the largest land war in human history, Japan delivered its own shocking blow, the surprise attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor. Well, the goal was to cripple the American fleet, giving Japan total freedom to conquer the Pacific. But what it actually did was awaken the sleeping giant. And just like that, the European conflict officially became a true world war. So, by the end of 1941, you got to admit the Axis powers looked absolutely invincible. I mean, they controlled most of Europe, a huge chunk of North Africa, and a vast empire in the Pacific. It seemed like nothing could stop them. So, the crucial question is, how did it all change? How did the Allies manage to stop this seemingly unstoppable force? That's really the question of the entire war, isn't it? How do you stop a global blitzkrieg? Well, the answer lies in 3 colossal, world-changing battles that all happened in the second half of 1942. These are the battles that completely, and I mean completely, turned the tide of the war across the entire globe. First up, the Pacific, the Battle of Midway. The U.S. Navy, thanks to some absolutely brilliant code breaking, knew the Japanese were coming. They laid an ambush, and in one battle, they sank 4 of Japan's best aircraft carriers. 4. It was a devastating blow, and their Navy, especially their corps of veteran pilots, would never recover. The offensive power of Japan in the Pacific was basically broken just 6 months after Pearl Harbor. Then let's go to the deserts of North Africa. At the Second Battle of El Alamein, a massive Allied force of 230,000 troops finally stopped the legendary Desert Fox, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. This victory secured the Mediterranean and started the process of kicking the Axis out of Africa for good. It was the first step toward invading Italy. And finally, on the brutal, frozen Eastern Front, Hitler's obsession with capturing the city that had his enemy's name, Stalingrad, led to the encirclement and total destruction of one entire German army, the Sixth Army. His stubborn refusal to allow a retreat, born of pure ego, shattered the myth of German invincibility and marked the beginning of the end for the Nazis in the Soviet Union. Okay, so those victories were huge. They turned the tide for sure. But winning the war? That was a whole different story. The path to victory was going to be a long, brutal, bloody grind. It would require overwhelming force, not just on the battlefield, but in the factories and on the assembly lines back home. Now, this is what's really fascinating. The true secret weapon of the war wasn't a tank or a plane. It was production. Sure, Germany had brilliant tanks and Japan had incredibly skilled pilots, but they simply could not compete with the sheer industrial output of the Allies. The United States, especially, transformed into what they called the arsenal of democracy, just churning out planes, tanks, and ships at a rate the Axis couldn't even dream of. In the end, that industrial power was the real foundation of victory. And all of that industrial might came together in the single largest amphibious invasion in history, D-Day. The scale was just mind-boggling. We're talking about assembling a force of over 7,000 ships, brilliantly tricking the enemy about where the real landing was going to be, and a gut-wrenching decision by General Eisenhower to go for it in really risky weather. The successful storming of the Normandy beaches opened up that critical second front and began the liberation of Western Europe. From the frozen forests of the Battle of the Bulge to the black volcanic sands of Iwo Jima, the final year of the war saw some of the most brutal, horrific fighting of the entire conflict. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the world they left behind was, well, it was almost unrecognizable. The end of the war triggered these massive, seismic shifts. The true, unimaginable horror of the Holocaust was revealed, which led to the Nuremberg trials. The United Nations was formed with the hope of preventing something like this from ever happening again. The old European empires crumbled, and two new superpowers, the USA and the USSR, rose from the rubble, which immediately set the stage for the Cold War. And, of course, the use of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki thrust all of humanity into the terrifying new atomic age. And this just brilliantly illustrates the sober, fundamental lesson humanity tried to learn from all that carnage. This inscription is carved on a memorial stone placed right outside the very house where Adolf Hitler was born in Austria. I mean, think about that. It's such a powerful reminder of what was at stake, placed in the absolute last location you'd ever expect to find it. Millions of dead are a warning. That message is just as urgent today as it was back in 1945. And it leaves us with the critical question we have to keep asking ourselves over and over again. Have we actually kept that promise?